Far to the northeast of classical Greece, at the edges of the known world, Greek colonies situated along the coast of the Black Sea traded with a semi-nomadic people that both they and we know as the Scythians. While we only have a limited amount of written information on these people, our most lengthy account comes from Book 4 of the Histories written by Herodotus in the 5th century BC, who informs us that they occupied the land between the southern Danube and the Don, and then extended eastward across the Pontic Steppe, with their control terminating roughly along the forest belt which stretches across much of modern Ukraine and southern European Russia. Between 1697 and 1698, the Russian Tsar, Peter the Great, was visiting England as part of his grand embassy across Europe in order to gather information and techniques with which to modernize his country. While there, he paid a visit to the Asmolean Museum and observed a collection of artifacts which came from the Pontic Steppe. Peter was so intrigued that he began to fund research expeditions to the area in order to find more artifacts, and while not every Russian Tsar followed in his footsteps, many of them did. In 1830, excavation began at the site of Koloba, conducted by a team based out of the Museum of Kerch, and it began to be confirmed that the kurgans, the large burial mound on the steppe, which had been excavated since governmental patronage began a century or so prior, very likely belonged to the Scythians. The material being taken out of the earth, combined with the translation of Herodotus into Russian in the late 18th century, largely confirmed what he had written, and by the 1850s, Scythian studies in its modern form as an academic discipline had begun to emerge. The first traces of nomadism extend back to the Neolithic, where they formed a mirror to early farming societies cropping up along river systems. This phenomenon is broadly categorized as Eurasian nomadism, and it's broken up into smaller subcategories based on differences in societal structures and economic patterns. And, while there were earlier cultures that relied heavily on the horse and which did practice nomadism, the Scythians have come to typify a form of nomadism on the Eurasian steppe which would dominate for roughly a millennia, essentially being dependent upon horses, horse archers, and often basing their economies upon wealth of the hoof, essentially herding. Between about 1950 and about 1975, the study of Scythians and of nomadism in Eurasia exploded, and this form of social organization is now often recognized by anthropologists as the cognitive revolution of the steppe, as drastic and as far-reaching in its consequences as settled agriculture has been. However, the proliferation of Scythian archaeology, combined with recent work in genetics, has revealed that they have their origins not in or near the Pontic Steppe, but probably farther east. The archaeology of Iron Age nomads between about 800 BC at the earliest and about 200 BC at the very latest are typified by the presence of the so-called Scythian triad, a burial custom which, while not exactly identical in every respect, tends to be marked by large kurgans which contain three types of objects: horse bridles, daggers and composite bows, or at least their remains, and animal-style art. It extends beyond locations where Scythians are recorded to have been, deep into Siberia, leading many archaeologists to classify this as the Scytho-Siberian world. There are a few who would object to this on various grounds, but in general, this is the archaeological horizon in which the Scythians originated. It is precisely because of the extent of this triad that, while the Scythians themselves do form a distinct group in the history of the Eurasian steppe, it also represents a broad tradition out of which others also formed, which has led to professional scholars often using the term Scythian both in reference to the historical people themselves and to a general shared way of livelihood and culture on the Iron Age steppe. Tracing back the presence of the Scythian triad, when combined with advances in genetics which allow us to more accurately track population movements, and when combined with classical texts which tell us that these people emerged out of the east and then partly displaced and partly conquered earlier peoples on the Pontic steppe, leads deep into Siberia, to the modern Republic of Tuva. 60 kilometers northwest of Kyzyl, the capital city, lies the Uyuk River, a tributary of the Yenisei. As the Uyuk winds towards that larger river, it moves through the Uyuk Valley, nestled in the shadow of the Altai Mountains. The region is considered a World Heritage Site, and for very good reason. Among locals, the Uyuk Valley has another name: the Valley of the Kings. Within a total area of about 130,000 hectares, there are over 1,000 kurgans spread across the valley, with some reaching heights of 6 meters and diameters of over 100. Some of these kurgans are solitary, but some, when viewed from the air, appear to be arranged in lengthy chains, snaking across the valley. Digging began here in 1915, and it's largely responsible for starting the academic study of Tuvan archaeology. But what matters for the Scythians are two excavation projects conducted between 1971 and 1974, and 2001 and 2003. Those two kurgans are designated Arzhan 1 and Arzhan 2, named so because the artifacts in the time period correspond to the Arzhan archaeological culture, which flourished in the region between about the 9th and the 8th centuries BC. In the 1970s, arguably the most pressing question was where and when did Eurasian nomadism as it existed during the Iron Age, characterized by nomads primarily riding on horseback, in other words, not necessarily employing wagons to a substantial degree, and their characteristic way of warfare, the horse archer, develop. It was considered a pressing question because more and more archaeology dating to the Iron Age was suggesting that this was a new development, which had substantially reformed or outright abandoned earlier methods of societal organization and nomadic techniques which were present during the preceding Bronze Age. In the tomb of Arzhan I, archaeologists appear to have found the answer, and those findings still more or less hold up today. To date, there are approximately 3,000 kurgans across the steppe which are confirmed to be Scythian. Of those 3,000, approximately 60 date between the 7th and the 6th century BC, with most of them dating to later centuries, in particular some 2,000 date to the 4th century BC. Arzhan I definitely predates all of these, with radiocarbon dating the kurgan to roughly the 9th century, so it precedes other known Scythian tombs by about 100 years at the very least. The overall structure is approximately circular in shape, with the exterior being enclosed by a stone wall, which then supported stone slabs which rested on top of the tomb, leading to a central platform, atop which was erected a deer stone, although only half of that stone survives. The central grave of the kurgan is 5 meters square, and it's set within a grave chamber that is 8 meters square, and this is where the tomb becomes extremely interesting. There are 8 coffins in addition to the 2 main bodies, which have been interpreted as being evidence of the ritual slaying of the leader's bodyguard or entourage so that they can accompany him in death. The central chamber is constructed out of larch logs, and the wooden structure then extends outward from that chamber to construct about 70 additional rectangular chambers, all laid out roughly parallel with each other as they extend outward from the center of the kurgan. Now, when viewed from above, all of these chambers appear to resemble the rays of the sun. That particular feature has led archaeologists to argue that there probably is a general solar theme about the entire complex, backed up by the fact that the stone wall which encloses the kurgan has a separate structure of larger, curved boulders on the eastern side arranged in a crescent, and smaller, rougher-hewn stones on the western side, which could be meant to symbolize the rising and the setting of the sun. And although solar symbols and solar deities are present all across the world, on the Eurasian steppe they do appear to hold a particular importance, especially during the Iron Age. And as far as construction is concerned, those rays do appear to be unique to this particular tomb. Most of the chambers that comprise the rays, not all of them of course, but most of them, contain weapons, armor, or bridles, and most importantly there are over 150 horses as well, complete with armor and human skeletons that are presumed to be their riders, and the weapons and armor presumed to belong to those people. All of these horses and riders surround the bodies of a man and a much younger woman who lay in the central grave. Unfortunately, Arzhan I was robbed at some point, but there is enough evidence remaining for archaeologists to determine that their coffins and the central chamber were richly decorated at one point with tapestries, gold, and turquoise, and they were laid to rest on a bed of at least 20 horsetails. The apparent wealth and solar symbolism of the tomb signifies that the man buried here was somebody of importance, but how important that individual was is truly signified by the horses and the riders who surround his body within Arzhan I. An analysis of the horse gear and the armor strongly suggests that many of those buried in the complex came from various distances. In other words, many of them were probably not locals. What this has been interpreted to mean is that the man buried in the central chamber of Arzhan I probably had a significant amount of political and social power across an extremely large area. Another way of putting that, then, is that what we're looking at in the archaeology may potentially be the earliest evidence of something resembling the leader of a horde, or potentially even the earliest Scythian king. Surrounding the kurgan were a further 300 burial pits which contained the remains of horses, sheep, goats, pigs, and cattle. Many of the bones of the animals show evidence of butchering, and it's not certain if this was all done at the same time and thus it represents a massive feast, or if it represents a series of celebrations conducted over months or maybe even years in honor of the man and possibly even the woman buried in the tomb. Whatever the case may be, and although archaeologists may eventually discover earlier tombs, the complex of Arzhan 1 remains one of the most unique and certainly one of the most intriguing kurgans on the Eurasian steppe. And, as of right now, it is the earliest evidence for something potentially reflecting widespread political power in the region, and possibly even an early attempt at a Scythian monarchy.